Good evening, you're watching Left, Right and Centre. I'm Nidhi Razdan. Nearly 10 days after the clash between Chinese and Indian troops at the line of actual control in Arunachal Pradesh, the opposition continues to press the government to allow a discussion in parliament, which the government is refusing to do. Speaking in the Lok Sabha today, Foreign Minister S Jaishankar also objected to Rahul Gandhi's use of the word pitai in the context of these clashes, saying our jawans are standing at 13,000 feet, defending our border and do not deserve this word. So that's triggered off another political storm. Now, as the political spat intensifies, the threat from China on the ground is all too real. High-resolution satellite images accessed by NDTV within days of the Tawang clashes indicate that Beijing has positioned a large number of drones and fighter aircraft at major Tibetan airbases, which are ranged against India's northeast. These come as India's Air Force maintains combat air patrols over the skies of Arunachal because of increased Chinese air activity. In the last few weeks, the Air Force has also scrambled its fighter jets on at least 2 occasions after detecting Chinese aircraft that threatened to breach Indian airspace over Arunachal. My colleague Vishnu Shom has this exclusive report.
Well, let's start by bringing you an image of December 15th of China's Bangda Air Base. That's located 150 kilometers northeast of Arunachal Pradesh. Now, these images, which you're going to see shortly, coincide with major Indian Air Force exercises being held in the state and are just 6 days after the Tawang clashes, indicating that the Chinese have continued to deploy frontline Air Force assets, including drones and jets against India. So, on the flight line, there are 2 drones, including one of the most advanced drones in the world, a state-of-the-art WZ-7 soaring drone. Also present at the same location, 2 fighters, Chinese variants of the Sukhoi 30 that the Indian Air Force operates. What you see here is an image from Shigatse on the 27th of November, which shows 10 Chinese fighters on the flight line. Again, Chinese variants of the Sukhoi 30 that India operates. And as you can see, several drones as well for intelligence and possibly attack missions. What we can now show you, and this is really important, is Lhasa Airport. On the tarmac, 4 Chinese J-10 fighters, advanced jets that Pakistan has also acquired from China. And what we can now share with you are images of the remarkable changes at these frontline Chinese air bases, major upgrades over just the last few years. The pace of development startling. Firstly, here's an image of Bangda Airport in February 2021. That's on your screen. Now, this is the same airport a few days back where you can see a new dispersal area which has been marked. That dispersal area which is there, which we marked. It's not there in the top image, it's in the image below. Finally, here's an image of Lhasa Airport in February 2021. Let's go to the next image, which shows Lhasa Airport. Here is the same airport a few days later. There is a new runway under construction, which we marked out in the bottom of your screen. That is an image from just a couple of days back. There are other new constructions as well. India, which has traditionally had an advantage over the Chinese Air Force through well-established bases in Tezpur, Misamari, Jorhat, Hashimara and Bagdogra, is now having to contend with a large number of new generation Chinese jets and drones, while its own prescribed squadron strength continues to fall. For now, the IF will rely on a squadron of Rafale fighters deployed in Hashimara, in addition to units of the recently acquired S-400 surface-to-air missile system from Russia. Ironically, China operates the identical missile system also acquired from Russia. So what does this all mean? Well, China's upgrade of its air bases and aviation assets, including fighters, transports, drones, electronic warfare and reconnaissance assets since the border tension with India began in 2020 has been staggering by any definition. Vishnu Shom for NDTV.
So on one hand, that threat from China, very all-pervasive, very real. On the other hand, a very ugly political spat breaking out back home between the opposition and the government on these latest clashes in Arunachal. The foreign minister today ticking off Rahul Gandhi for using the word pitai or beating in reference to what happened with India's jawans.
So we have no problem if there is political differences, if there is even political criticism, I have heard sometimes that my own understanding needs to be deepened. When I see who is giving the advice, I can only bow in respect. But I think we should not directly or indirectly criticize our jawans. Yeah. When our jawans, sir, are standing, sir, our jawans are standing, sir, in Yangtze, in Yangtze at 13,000 feet. At 13,000 feet, they are standing there defending our borders. They do not deserve to have the word pitai. The word pitai should not be used for our jawans, sir.
जिन्होंने 2000 स्क्वायर किलोमीटर हिंदुस्तान का उठा लिया, जिन्होंने हिंदुस्तान के 20 जवानों को शहीद किया, जो हमारे जवानों को अरुणाचल प्रदेश में पीट रहे हैं, मैंने कहा हिंदुस्तान की प्रेस मुझसे इनके बारे में एक सवाल नहीं पूछेगी। हिंदुस्तान की सरकार सोई हुई है। इस बात को हिंदुस्तान की सरकार सुनना नहीं चाहती, मगर उनका प्रिपरेशन चल रहा है और प्रिपरेशन यूथ का है।
Well, is that fair criticism? We'll talk about that in just a moment. Let me introduce our panelists this evening. Brahmachalani, strategic affairs expert and commentator, joining us tonight. Lieutenant General Rameshwar Yadav will be joining us shortly. Former Director General Infantry of the Indian Army, Suhasini Haidar, the national editor and diplomatic affairs editor of The Hindu. From the BJP, Lalita Kumaramangalam is with us, and Nasir Hussain, Rajya Sabha MP of the Congress, is with us. Thank you very much to all of you for joining us. Brahmachalani, wanted to ask you first, as Vishnu's reported there, what is alarming is just, the speed at which China is building up infrastructure, the way they've positioned these drones and fighter aircraft at these air bases. How do you look at the way they are sort of aggressively positioning themselves?
China has been continuing a frenzied build-up of its military infrastructure and its access, but India has mounted a strong military response to China's aggression. There can be no doubt about that. In fact, India has more than matched China's Himalayan military deployments and has made clear that bilateral ties cannot return to normal until border peace and tranquility is restored. But here is the key point. Deterrence to be effective must extend beyond military strength to the use of all available tools. And I wish the government of India also employed non-military cards, including exercising India's major trade leverage. Deterrence cannot just rely on military deployments. It has to include economic and diplomatic tools. It's incomprehensible why India remains reticent about naming and shaming China for its border aggression. That border aggression violates all the bilateral agreements. These are binding agreements which China has violated. China rakes up Kashmir issue in the UN Security Council, and yet we are reluctant to speak up on the Chinese aggression. Why this coyness on the Indian government's part? And more fundamentally, why is India reluctant to impose meaningful costs on China, including by exercising its trade leverage? The Indian ban on Chinese mobile phone apps and the restriction on Chinese companies' access to Indian government contracts have been no more than an annoyance for Beijing. Right through this military crisis, China's trade surplus with India has continued to surge to the extent...
Absolutely. In fact, after Galwan, trade...
If I could just add one line, to the extent that it has overtaken India's total defense budget. This is now the third largest bilateral trade surplus in the world. In effect, China is having its cake and eating it too. It is time to make India's deterrence strategy more robust by broadening its scope.
It's interesting you say that. You're saying that there's also need to be more vocal and call out Chinese aggression for what it is. And before I come to the political aspect of this, General Rameshwar Yadav, just wanted to bring you in here. This is, as we were discussing last week, a sort of a war with China on multiple fronts already. There is the LAC, which is tense. There is cyber warfare. You saw what happened at the servers at the All India Institute of Medical Sciences. So this is a multiple front that has opened. And therefore, would you agree with Brahmachalani that there are costs India can impose and that it must use those cards?
Of course. India can pose a lot of caution on China. And what you're talking about, this cyber attack and what their deployment on in Ladakh, and now they've come to the eastern sector, this part of their hybrid warfare. And the psychological warfare is a mainstay of Chinese strategy. So, and they are doing it, and they're doing it since 1950. It's not a new thing. And I fully agree with the fellow panelist. Now it is time we must go proactive and we must take certain actions so that the heat is felt by China.
But are we in a position, Suhasini Haider, just to bring you in here, are we in a position to impose those costs? That's the question, because there's a reason why our trade deficit with China is so high. We are still so dependent on Chinese imports. Our manufacturing has not really taken off the way it should have, and it will take some time to do that. So are we in a position to impose severe costs even economically?
You see, everything is possible under certain conditions.
That question was for Suhasini Haider, sir. Sorry, I'll come back to you.
Okay.
Yeah.
You know, to take it away from the military sphere, Nidhi, the fact is the first cost, if you like, that one has to impose as a country is to understand what has actually happened. In a sense, nothing makes it easier for the Chinese side to continue its aggression if the Indian position is that nothing has happened, that no Chinese soldiers have entered Indian territory, that all these clashes that have happened somehow conveniently just near the LAC, but without telling us exactly which side they are. I am not trying in any way to diminish what the soldiers have done, what the Indian Army has done at the LAC. But the government's continued silence is problematic. As journalists who have covered this now for 2 years with the barest of resources, simply because the government gives us no access, does not want the story discussed. Every time one discusses a story, it becomes about questioning the military or being anti-national about it. I think there comes a point at which now we have seen these aggressions, and even by the government's own account of them, whether it is Ladakh, whether it is Doklam. In fact, Doklam is now back in, and the Hindu has done a series of stories there. And whether it is now what we have seen in Arunachal, which the defense minister has said in parliament, the question has to be, what is the diplomatic next step that has been taken? The Prime Minister has made no statement since June 2020. We stay by what the Prime Minister has said, or is there an update about what he said at that time about nobody having come inside? Secondly, just a month ago, Prime Minister Modi met with President Xi Jinping. Again, a complete silence around that meeting. We were told cordialities were exchanged, but what kind of cordialities can be exchanged at this kind of a time at the line of actual control? So the question, did the Prime Minister raise the LAC? Did he suggest some way forward on the LAC in those 5 minutes or whatever that we saw them on video talking to each other? But there is complete silence about it. And third, the fact that journalists have not been given access. I think this is really the first such situation we have seen where for 2 years journalists are given no access, given no briefings. All the information that is coming out comes out post-fact. Even the Tawang clash, even the Arunachal Pradesh clash in Yangtze that we saw, essentially was disclosed after newspapers, including the Hindu, came out with stories, and then the government spoke in parliament. So I think the first thing, the first step, you were saying, that we must have the capability to push back. The first point of a pushback is to tell the other side, we know what you're doing. We are telling the world what you are doing. Instead, it seems as if it is just complete silence. And I will say there is a real marked difference between the way such skirmishes or such transgressions at the LAC are dealt with and the ones at the LOC with Pakistan are dealt with. And that is the real contrast if we want to see how a proactive...
That's true, because you do see Lalita Kumaramangalam, a much more high-pitched rhetoric. Pakistan is called out for cross-border terrorism. It is named, it is shamed on the international stage. But as both Suhasini Haider and Mr. Brahmachalani have pointed out, we're not even willing to take China's name to call out their aggression. And there has been so much silence. Why the silence? Why is our leadership not taking this country into confidence? And may I say this as well, that isn't an important part of national security strategy also to have a politically united front at home? I mean, right now the Chinese must be looking at this political spat in India and laughing.
Nidhi, you seem to be hinting at, or not hinting, you seem to be very clearly trying to put the entire blame for whatever you say is wrong on the BJP shoulders, on the government shoulders. Now, yes, we are the government who are there now in place at the center. And the defense minister, after having made a statement, it is unfortunate that our opposition and large parts of our press continue to criticize things and politicize things in such a way that not only our jawans get disheartened, but also it is very clear to international observers that the Indian polity is not united in the aggression that China, in facing the aggression that China regularly unleashes on us. With regard to Mr. Modi's meeting with Mr. Xi, it was hardly 5 or 10 minutes. In 5 or 10 minutes in international diplomacy, I'm sure the people on this or everybody else on this panel is more experienced than me on international diplomacy, and they'd agree. You can't discuss, and you don't discuss issues like border clashes or what is going to happen if you're going to put economic sanctions, because I think that is one of the things that was hinted at. That's not, I mean, it's not done in 5 or 10 minutes. And whatever, I mean, when you meet somebody who's considered not exactly a friendly country to India on an international stage, you don't make a fool of yourself. Nobody. By you, I mean nobody in India. No politician, I think, would make that mistake. Especially somebody with as many years of experience as our prime ministers, all of them have had. You don't make a fool of your country by, demanding replies on something on which we are obviously on two different sides of the fence. And I don't mean allegorically. I mean
no,
actually.
But why is there a reluctance to have a
That's
discussion on this in Parliament? When India and China were at war in 1962, there was a discussion in Parliament. So why not take the opposition into confidence? Obviously, if there are operational things that can't be discussed, that's understood. That will not be discussed.
Part of that answer lies in your statement itself. In the 1960s, we had a full-fledged war. These are skirmishes which have been going back for a very long time, as the general said, for more than 70, 80 years now almost. And the government has been pushing its infrastructure and defense expenditure. It's just ironic to me today that when I hear the same people who question us on how much we're spending on defense infrastructure and on infrastructure in the border areas, are also criticizing us simultaneously at the same time, saying, why are we not doing enough? Now, the BJP has been in power for 8 years. I'm not trying to make excuses for the BJP government, but India and China have been, rivals. I think that's the kindest or the most polite word to use tonight, for much, much more than that. Now, ascribing blame to one particular person or one particular party doesn't really help when you're facing an enemy as strong and as I won't say united, because that's
it's not a question of blame. I think it's a question of just having a political.
You're making it very clear that it's a blame game that's been played today on NDTV on the television.
I don't know why you're attacking NDTV, ma'am. Your party is the government in power, and it will be held to account for what is happening on our borders, on national security. It won't be the opposition. So please, let's leave the barbs aside for a minute. Let's please leave the barbs aside. Let me ask the Congress though. We have Mr. Nasir Hussain. I'm sorry, I'm going to go on to Mr. Nasir Hussain of the Congress. Just to, come back to constructive criticism. There's, one thing to criticize and say, okay, the government needs to come up and speak, debate. It needs to be more open about what's happening with China. But Mr. Hussain, is it fair of Rahul Gandhi to say that the government is sleeping while China is preparing for a war? Because it's very clear the government, let's face it, they're not asleep. I mean, you have a huge troop build-up on the Indian side as well. Ties are not completely normal with China. Yes, they're not being very open about what is happening with China. But is it fair to say that they're asleep?
Nidhi, I think the whole issue of India-China border dispute is about the diplomatic failure of our political leadership of the country. What is more important here is the army fights on both the sides. The jawans fight. We are with the valor of the jawan. We stand by them. We have made this ample clear time and again. So let us not get the army into this. What is more important is this diplomacy of jhula, this diplomacy of jhappi, this diplomacy of shaking hands and putting the videos in the public domain without any audios, is not gaining anything to India. Every time the Prime Minister meets his counterpart from China, next 1 week or so there is some sort of a scuffle of the border. Has he tried to raise this issue in international forums? What is the diplomacy involved here? Has he tried to expose them? Has he tried to name and shame them? So what is it that is happening? The parliament has a right to know. The parliamentarians are elected representatives of the people of your country. The opposition and the MPs in the treasury bunches have a right to know. So every time you say that nothing is happening, you say there is now disengagement happening. How is disengagement happening when there is no engagement? Prime Minister Modi says that not even an inch of our land has been occupied. But there are satellite images which say that PLA's subdivisional office has been constructed there. There are tall towers there. There are bridges. There are villages that have been constructed. So either come out and say this is all false. Why shouldn't we have a discussion on this issue? Okay, let us not discuss the strategy of the army that will be involved there. But we can always discuss, we always have a right to know, see what is the actual situation there. Jaishankar comes and say it is worrying that the buildup by the Chinese army on the border is something that we should be worried about. He said this in February 2022. Now the government says there is nothing happening there. So the statement of Jaishankar is true or the statement given by Prime Minister Modi is true. What is happening there?
All right. So
we have a right and we are asking a debate, we are asking a discussion well within the rules of both the houses, Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha. So I think it is a diplomatic failure of this government. The political leadership has failed. I am not criticizing the army here. The political leadership has failed to take up this issue, to see that there are no skirmishes, there are no scuffles, there is no occupation of our lands, and there is no enough that is being done to see that this crisis is solved.
Brahma Chalani, when you look at the sort of political fallout of this, I mean domestically, how important is it in your view to have a political consensus? If not a discussion in Parliament, would you say that at the very least an all-party meeting to take, all parties on board is called for?
I think an all-party meeting can be called if the government is reluctant to have a debate in Parliament. But in my view, a debate in Parliament on China's border aggression can only strengthen the Indian government's hand against Beijing. It will underscore the deep concern and angst in India over China's aggressive actions in open violation of bilateral agreements. After all, after changing the LAC in Ladakh in ways that seriously disadvantage India militarily, China is now eyeing Tawang. Tawang could be its next target, and its alarming slicing against India will likely persist as part of a strategy to incrementally advance its territorial expansionism and keep India off balance. So against this background, the government should welcome an open debate in Parliament as part of its public diplomacy to spotlight China's aggression. There's no apparent downside to having a debate in Parliament. The government doesn't have to disclose anything sensitive.
Exactly.
It only has to listen to the views and concerns expressed by members. In fact, Nidhi, such a debate will be a welcome opportunity for Prime Minister Modi to break his long silence on the China border crisis. He has kept mum on this subject for 2.5 years. Mr. Modi could make a brief statement during the debate in Parliament, leaving it to Defence Minister Rajnath Singh to reply to the substantive points raised by the members. So I do hope there will be a debate in Parliament, or at least a all-party meeting. In fact, as long as the border crisis persists, every session of Parliament ought to debate China's aggression so as to help sharpen the country's public diplomacy. How else can a democracy like India strengthen its public diplomacy?
I think that's very well put, Mr. Chalani. I'd like to take that to Lalita Kumara Mangalam. Ma'am, if you just hear what Brahma Chalani's sort of view on this is, how would you respond to that? I mean, I know you'll attack the Congress, but here is Mr. Chalani, who's done a lifetime of work on China and Chinese aggression against India, who's saying a healthy parliamentary debate will actually strengthen India's hand. And he's right, it would. You'll actually probably come away showing a far more united India than China would expect.
Nidhi, I'm sorry, Mr. Chalani, I couldn't hear all of what you said, but towards the end, I did hear most of what you said. I quite agree with what he says, that a healthy parliamentary debate will strengthen the hands of the Indian government towards China, will strengthen the hands of the country, not just the government, towards facing this aggression from China. But the point is that, unfortunately, most parliamentary debates end up being totally unhealthy. Everything becomes too political, and it again becomes what I called it, a blame game, tu main, as they say in Hindi. I wish it wasn't that way. But if the parliament, if the defense minister has made a statement, and okay, he's made a very short statement, and I know that, I'm sure if parliament, if the government feels that it is necessary, they will have a discussion. But the point is that the discussion has to be, balanced from all sides. Not just from the government, but also from the opposition.
Let me ask
China
Mr.
is
Nasir
nobody's
Hussain.
friend in India.
Mr. Nasir
No
Hussain,
Indian,
are you going to
regardless
reduce
of
the
whether
debate
BJP or
into
not,
just a tutu meme? I mean, I have to
considers
say though,
China
the parliament
a friend.
debates I have seen, many of them have actually been on some of the most contentious issues, have actually been the most riveting to watch. Whether it was on the India-US nuclear deal or so many other issues over the years, they've been feisty. They've actually revealed the best of Indian democracy. I say that as a citizen. But Mr. Hussain, are you ready for a quote-unquote healthy, constructive debate?
Nidhi, I think Indian Parliament in the last 75 years has seen some of the finest debates on very important issues concerning the people of our country, concerning external affairs, concerning diplomacy, concerning economic issues. But I think to belittle the Parliament by saying that it's always tu main, maybe on some political issues it is at certain times, but most of the time it has been constructive, civilized, dignified, and well-articulated debates in the Parliament. Why? My question is very simple. Mr. Jaishankar comes, External Affairs Minister, he makes a statement on foreign policy, makes a statement on external affairs. He speaks about every country in the world except the Chinese-India border dispute. Mr. Rajnath Singh, the Defense Minister, comes, 1.5 paragraph statement, and he says nothing is everything changa se, and he goes away, doesn't even take clarification. While the convention in the Parliament is, whenever a statement is made by any minister, any member, whether it is from the treasury benches or from the opposition, can seek clarification on certain issues, which the minister generally gives, generally clarified. Here he didn't even wait for a minute, he just walked off. So my question and the question of all the opposition parties is, why is the government not coming out for a discussion in the Parliament? What is it hiding? Why it is so hush-hush about this entire India-China border dispute? Has it failed miserably politically and diplomatically on this issue, and they are not able to face the Parliament, or there is something else to be hidden from the parliamentarians and the people of the country? So
Hasni Haider, just getting a last comment on the political debate over this. How important do you think it is to have this discussion openly in Parliament at the if nowhere else, or an all-party meeting, or somewhere where silence can be broken finally?
Well, at the end of the day, Nidhi, democracies do things differently. If a democracy is being challenged by another country, it doesn't matter what they are saying or not saying. Eventually, we have to hold ourselves to that standard, where at least there is an explanation. This idea that everything that is a demand for explanation or transparency is turned into a kind of an anti-national narrative is unfair to India, that is a democracy. I saw the panelists saying that it was a 5-minute conversation between the Prime Minister and Xi Jinping. Well, it was a similar unstructured 5-minute conversation between Prime Minister Modi and the US President at the same Bali summit, where we saw the Ministry of External Affairs putting out a proper readout of what was discussed. It's not unfair or too much to expect that there is that level of transparency when your jawans are at the line of actual control, looking like it is an active combat. It may not be about gunfire, but it is an active combat. The question of what was discussed and what is the current situation is important to all citizens. So getting away from even this political debate, if there was, after all, the Prime Minister did at one point in June, on June 20th, I think, 2020, June 19th, he did choose to make that statement to the country. at an all-party meeting. It shouldn't be too much to expect that there is that kind of clarity, that there is that kind of transparency that takes everyone along with it. And as journalists, this is all that we are asking for, is that give us the clarity, because it doesn't make sense that a clash of the seriousness of the kind we saw in Arunachal Pradesh last week is only disclosed by the government 4 days later, 3 days after there's already been a commanders meeting on the issue. So I don't think these are irrational or unfair demands for transparency on a debate that has consumed the nation now for more than 2 years.
Absolutely. Last word to you, Lieutenant General Yadav. Just from a strategic military perspective, how concerned are you, by the Chinese building up the infrastructure the way that they are? Are you anticipating a lot more trouble, in a sense, along different parts of the line of actual control now in the months and years ahead?
You see, what is matter of concern is that China has opened up another front in the current situation. That is one thing that we have to take care of. Second thing is Yangtze. Why Yangtze? So Yangtze is a feature which is high, around 16,000 feet high. And we have presence there in case Chinese would have captured that. In that case, they would have formed in that area during winters. Then it will be very difficult to evict them, and eviction means it will be amount to a war. This is what China is trying to do. They are trying to provoke us. So it is a very serious matter as of now from the military point of view. And moreover, China is getting concerned on the kind of infrastructure that we are creating. And in Tawang sector, it is the sailor tunnel that is coming in. That will give very high capabilities to Indian Army to operate throughout the year. And that is a matter of concern for China. And they feel that a threat is building up in this sector.
Right.
And Yangtze, probably one of the reasons is this. This is what happened in Ladakh also. We had a new road alignment from Dobruk to DBO. And you have seen the way they have reacted.
Interesting. And as you put it, sir, rightly, that it's a serious situation. It's not just another border skirmish, as some are trying to project it. These are serious incidents, and they have a bearing on national security. Thank you very much, though, to all of you for joining us. I'm glad we're at least able to debate this on television, if nowhere else. Thanks very much for being with us. Moving on, a new survey has revealed a very dismal picture on the state of primary schools in Jharkhand, especially after the pandemic. The survey, which was done of 138 primary and upper primary schools in 16 districts of the state, shows, amongst other things, that not a single school had functional toilets, electricity and water supply. I'm talking about all three here. 2/3 of the teachers said that their school did not have adequate funds for the midday meals. In a majority of schools, teachers felt that most of their students had actually forgotten how to read and write by the time the schools reopened in February of 2022. Very few schools had a pupil-teacher ratio below 30, which is prescribed under the Right to Education Act. And 20% of the schools had a single teacher, and nearly all the children in these single-teacher schools are Dalits or Adivasis. Well, this survey was conducted, amongst others. It was prepared by economist John Rez and researcher Paran Amitav. John Rez now joining us live on the program. Professor John Rez, thank you for being with us. Very, very sad to see the findings of this report. Is some of this a legacy from the pre-COVID times, which was actually exacerbated by the pandemic?
Yes, good question, Nidhi. First of all, I think you have summarized some of the main findings very well. I'll just make quickly two corrections. One is you said 20% of the schools had a single teacher. That is true for primary and upper primary schools. Now, of course, in the upper primary schools, single teachers are very rare because there are many children. If you look at the primary level, it is 35% of the schools that have a single teacher. This is absolutely extraordinary. All the more so as single teacher schools are plainly illegal. The Right to Education Act clearly says that every school should have at least 2 teachers. So that is one point. The other point is that one of the very important findings that you didn't mention is that the school attendance rates have really crashed. On the day of the survey, the pupil attendance rate was only 68% in the primary schools and 58%, barely half, in the upper primary school. And that brings me to your question, is this a kind of chronic issue or is it post-COVID? I think it's a little bit of both. I'm sure that in Jharkhand, even before COVID, the attendance rates were not anywhere near 100% or even 90%. But I really don't think they could have been as low as 58%. So I think we are also seeing a dramatic fallout of the COVID crisis when the schools were closed for 2 years in Jharkhand. This is a world record, even worse than Uganda, 83 weeks. And they lost the habit of going to school during that period. They also forgot a lot of whatever little they had learned.
I was going to come to that I think it's astounding that, your report points out that most people had actually forgotten how to read and write by the time the schools reopened.
Yes.
And are you concerned that this is not just limited to the 16 districts that you have covered in this report of Jharkhand, but that this could be perhaps something that we might be seeing in other parts of the country as well?
It's certainly across Jharkhand, and I'm sure it's to varying extents in other parts of the country as well. I think it's a national crisis. Quite likely Jharkhand is among the worst affected states, but I'm sure that most other states are also being affected to some extent. And what is really sad, certainly in Jharkhand, is that so little has been done to help these children who came back after 2 years having forgotten whatever little they had learned earlier, and now are basically struggling in a barely functional system. I think we talked about the single teachers is actually the tip of the iceberg of dramatic teacher shortages in Jharkhand. I think you mentioned that only 20% of the upper primary schools in Jharkhand have a pupil-teacher ratio below 30 as prescribed by the Right to Education Act. So there are drastic shortages of teachers, and the single teacher schools is one aspect of that.
Right.
And that makes it, of course, very difficult to address this crisis.
Well, Professor Tres, finally, has there been any response from the Jharkhand government to your report? We tried to reach out to them but didn't hear back. Have they said anything?
It's a little early because the report was released today. We will see. I mean, so far, we have not been very successful in sensitizing the Jharkhand government to this issue. In fact, last year, after a similar survey, when we found that the children were in such a pathetic state, we had tried already around this time last year to persuade the Jharkhand government to initiate a big effort to help the children, to increase the education budget, to start after-school literacy classes, and none of that happened. So it's difficult to be very hopeful, but of course one has to keep trying.
Professor Jean Dresse, thank you very much for joining us on that important story, what should actually make the front pages of every newspaper tomorrow.
Absolutely.
Thanks very much.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much for being with us, sir.
Thank you, Nidhi. Thank you.